I'm telling you, man, there is a thing running around down here. His eyes were wild and intense as we trudged onward through the thick, cold fog which hovered over the crumbling neighborhoods towards the distant, dark river. But what does that mean, Patrick? I asked, my voice unable to veil the doubt and suspicion I felt. You say there's a thing, but that is not an explanation. You've dragged me out here to this forsaken shithole in the middle of the night. I hate this side of town. There's a reason no one comes down here night or day. It's full of damn ghosts. I've never seen a ghost down here, Tilly, but there's something roaming these alleys at night, and it's like nothing I've ever seen. How do you know it's not a ghost? Have you ever seen a plague ghost, Patty? The miserable spirit of some poor wretch who died down here, quarantined with the rest of the poor doomed wretches. There were almost 200 people trapped down here during the last outbreak. Yes, I know, the watchmen had to hold the line at Mid-City so that they couldn't cross the barricade. Militiamen walking the border with muskets and pistols, day and night, while they begged and screamed for help. My father was there, the same as yours. So there you go, I said, grabbing his shoulder and stopping in the street, raising the lantern up between us to bathe our faces in orange-yellow light. Imagine the twisted spirit of one of those pitiful beings, imprisoned here in these streets, roaming about seeking vengeance or salvation. That's why the priests say not to come down here. It's cursed with darkness and horror. Souls that cannot cross over, so great is their misery. I've never seen a ghost down here, Tilly, and I patrol at least 3 nights a week. But you're supposed to walk the border of the old barricade, not wander these streets alone. Have you gone mad? He rolled his eyes as he shook my hand loose and pointed to the empty, ruined town square before us, the toppled bell tower of the great church rising through the mist like a sullen giant. I've had to chase thieves down here weekly. They use this damnable neighborhood as a hideout, and I had to follow them 10 or 9 times. I kept thinking I saw something moving in the shadows and alleyways when I finally found the group of thieves had set up a thieves' den in that church, and I was going to try to convince the captain to give me a squad to come down here and roust them. I don't remember you saying anything to the captain. Of course not, because I never got to it. The night I found them all in the church cellar is when it happened. When what happened? When I saw the thing, the creature, demon, or whatever the bloody hell it is. I followed a damn pickpocket down here and saw them all get slaughtered. Nobody will believe me, Tilly, unless I have someone else's eyes on it, too. He'll believe you. You're as sober as a judge and his favorite at that. The grim truth of what he was saying was seeping in. What does it look like? I asked, as he began to walk forward again, pulling his flintlock from his belt. Like nothing I could ever imagine. It had a long, bony body that looked like old rotted meat, but it walked with great sharp-edged legs like that of a spider. Its face was like that of a praying mantis, but mingled with the features of a man. It climbed on walls like a centipede and was covered in long whip-like tendrils that writhed and snapped like a mass of snakes. He stopped for a moment as if lost in a memory. It was utterly silent but for when it struck, and in those moments it made a low humming sound as it tore through those men like a wheat reaper at harvest. At times there was a shrieking noise as well, but it was hard to tell over the screams of its victims. This is madness, Patty. There could be no such creature outside of nightmares, not here in the city. I followed, even as my every impulse was to abandon him to his delusions. I think it comes from the river. It looks like something of the swamp, something damp and moldy. Assuming this is real, I reasoned, we will be in ultimate danger the moment we see it, Pat. He paused and lowered his head as if arguing with himself in his mind. Aye, it is very dangerous. But I'm going mad, Tilly. I can't forget it. And at the same time, I wonder myself if it was real or some crazed fancy. I've got to know. I cannot pretend it does not exist. And if it is a dream, then I truly would love to have that release from this torment. If I am mad, then at least this thing does not live. I saw the momentous horror and confusion as he once more turned to face me. Can you at least come and verify that I am mad? That's all I ask. Come with me to the church. If I'm crazed, then I will gladly walk with you to the nearest tavern and celebrate my insanity, and thank all the high spirits that my vision was false. Meeting his gaze, I knew I could not refuse my friend in so desperate a state. I reinvented the situation in my mind and patted my actions as pity to one whose mind was ill with some dark fantasy. I would see no monster, I was sure, and after Patrick could calm himself and perhaps regain his stability. Nodding my consent, we continued towards the church at each other's elbow. However, far back in my mind, I had begun to wonder if such a thing as that were real, then it would be nothing of nature. It would have to be the most morbid of conjurations by some necromancy or summoning. Entering through the rotted remnants of the church doors, we cast our light into the dark corners and caving, uneven stone walls of the chapel. Rows of collapsed pews were strewn around us as he came to the great cobweb-veiled statue of the High Spirit Athenda, towering in the darkness over her tarnished and broken altar. Even now she held her spear high towards the heaven, as if pointing its tip at the massive hole above in the church roof. She seemed almost indignant, as if enraged at the state of her worship house. Just think, though, Patrick. What would a thing such as you described even be? It must be a thing of dream, I whispered hoarsely, once again attempting to reason him away from this quest. Perhaps, he replied, staring grimly at the sainted Lady of Honor's great statue. But perhaps it makes more sense to me the more I have thought of it. How's that? And I knew as he began to speak that this tactic of reasoning would almost assuredly begin to backfire if I allowed his discourse much focus. He had pulled his leather-bound flask from his coat and, taking several swallows, passed it to me. As I sniffed the contents, I noticed he was pointing through the empty windows of the rear of the church towards a small, barely visible tomb yard with the beam of his lantern. It's the river, I think, he waxed sullenly. Something such as this thing would have had to have come up from the south in the river, perhaps to feed on the dead after the plague. Listening, I took a sip of the cheap brandy and wished immediately he would cease this line of comment. Because there's so many bodies washed down in the river, I warned. It would have climbed out of the south swamp and just followed the trail all the way to its source. And here we are. Eventually it would eat through its larder, though, and then it would be hungry. It might start roaming a bit, picking off people from the town. I'll bet it could move through the sewers and flood drains easy enough. You make it sound clever, I coughed as the liquid burned my throat. Clever enough, as clever as any hungry beast, or perhaps with the cunning of a demon. So now it's a demon. I cannot say. I have no reference for this horror. It does remind me of the stories from the old church books about the wretched beings birthed by the dismal maid and her feral twin. So, now, it is a lost-begotten child of Arsemius and Hote. Do you not hear your own words, Pat? You have woven a grand fantasy around this vision. You sound like one of the sick minds from the sanitarium stacking one tale onto another until you cannot see past the wall you have built. You started with sight, now you have a history. Does that not strike you? He looked down as I handed back the flask as if he suffered a moment of shame or embarrassment. I had made him doubt, which to me at this point was a victory. I had no time to gloat this, however, for even as he began to respond, there came a loud crash from behind us, and we whirled, pistols drawn, staring out to the range of our lanterns into the hallway door behind the altar. It was just the rafters falling from the roof, I whispered, confident in my analysis. There's someone there in the shadows, he coughed, as he waved the beam of his lantern to the crumbled doorway next to the rear of the altar. There, in the warm glow, appeared the faint trace of what looked to be a wisp of smoke or a swirl of mist. Just as we had begun to marvel at the strange luminescent quality of this twisting cloud, a great cold wind blasted through the open glass-encrusted window frames. No sooner had I thought to warn Patrick to hood his lantern than the breeze had snapped the flame from existence and left us buried in cold, dismal light. I had sought to pull my cloak up and shield the flickering survivor in my own when it too was extinguished. I heard Patrick gasp my name when I saw him gesturing frantically at the same doorway where the wisps had assembled into a vaguely human-like shape which was slowly floating up the cellar doorway and approaching us silently. It is a ghost, Tilly," he exclaimed, as he stepped over and grabbed my arm firmly. Indeed, now the thing had become unmistakably an apparition of a robed figure, which was quickly closing the distance between us and the door. Now there was a light, but it was the cold, otherworldly luminescence of the spirit which fell over us. The presence of a ghost universally inspires a stark terror in one who beholds it, and this was no exception. Immediately, the powerful electric impulse to flee had taken my body, and only through years of experience was I able to still my own feet and quiet my pounding heart. I stood firm before it, as did my comrade, who, although was not running, he had dug his strong fingers into my arm with a grip backed by resisted panic. Years on the city watch had accustomed me to the presence of such things, as their appearance within the town walls was far from rarity. Countless nights I had been summoned to the homes of people who had for some reason found themselves the recipient of some spirit's visitation. This often ends with the summoning of a mystic or priest who specializes in the detachment of spirits. Not so much through the dispersal usually, as through communication. However, there are those times when the spirit remains an ongoing presence, and the living either learn to adapt or flee its presence. If the spirit is anchored to a person, the results of such visits are daunting. The ghost is a manifestation of unfinished business and is a symbolic representation of its own message. They have even been known rarely to aid the watch in the conclusion of crimes of violence. Staring up in the dimly glowing figure, I now could discern a pale face gradually becoming more recognizable as the countenance of a middle-aged woman wrapped in the long robes of a priestess of the high spirit Athinda. The medallion of her faith, a disc inlaid with the image of an eagle with wings outstretched visible around her neck. She hovered translucent before us, and yet seemed to gaze over our heads as if seeing something far away behind us. We said nothing, but waited quiet for her to continue the nature of her manifestation. I leaned over to Patrick and whispered, "I thought you never saw ghosts down here." "I never have before. This is the first." "Why have you come?" asked the spectre solemnly. She possessed the same distant quality I had seen in all spirits, which had manifested visually, as if she were possibly not fully present, or perhaps perceiving some different environment than ours. I looked to Patrick, and could see by his expression I could expect no forthcoming communication from him. He was awestruck by the sight of the spirit. Taking a deep breath and steadying myself, I cleared my throat nervously to speak. "My comrade here has witnessed a crime in this chapel, ma'am." I spoke as if I were parleying with any living bystander. "He saw great violence on these premises, and also a strange creature involved." "You are of the watch, then?" she said, and I hoped I was mistaken in hearing a tone of contempt in her voice. "We are, ma'am," I answered with a congenial a quality as I could muster under the circumstance. Men of the watch who cross the line of the quarantine border. What a rarity. I had not been mistaken. Her words dripped with abhorrence, as if she spoke of something which she carried deep disgust. Should you not be at some city tower, firing at sick children who beg for mercy? She spoke directly of the age in which our fathers had worked the city militia. Although I had never had to uphold such a reprehensible duty, I still winced with the pangs of guilt and shame for my father's sake. I could still remember being a child and hearing his sobs at night when the watch had been called to hold the quarantine line. Those were dark times indeed, ma'am. However, those days are past, and now we patrol these streets again. Really? And whom do you protect on these streets, watchman? The rats of the sewer? Or is your purpose to ensure that no survivors exist to crawl their way into the city? You say those days have passed. How long has it been? Almost 20 years, ma'am. A look of profound disturbance crossed over the ghost visage like ripples across the surface of a lake. So visible was the expression of shock and sorrow that I almost felt it as if it were my own. She had no sense of the passing of time and no means of marking its passage. My sweet Athinda, has it been that long? It does not seem so to me. Everything is different now. The world now seems so different. I often forget my state and relive those last days as if they were anew. I forget I am past and lose myself in the work of those last years, caring for the sick as the plague devoured this place. I had the blessing of Athinda and therefore was protected from the sickness. It is one of the gifts that Athinda grants her order. You could not get sick then, Patrick finally mumbled from his stupor. But you stayed. It was my duty and my honor that should I not be stricken with the sickness, that I would care for those who were to my last. I studied her proud countenance and wondered what had finally ended this great woman's life if it were not the plague. Also, I wondered what had anchored such a powerfully spiritual being to the material sphere. It is rare to see a ghost which was so deeply devoted and yet had not been taken to the spirit's side. Why are you here, watchman? What business have you in my temple? As I had said, there was a crime. For the first time I saw her gaze meet mine, and my very blood seemed to chill and run ice cold in my veins. Have you seen anything such as that recently? I coughed out my nervous words. I have not. But you must have, Patrick burst, as if forgetting the circumstance. Perhaps you were in another state, ma'am, I quickly interjected, desperately wanting to avoid raising the spirit's agitation. If she were to become hostile, we might find ourselves in a most certainly losing confrontation. There was very little that two such as us could do to contend with a wrathful apparition, especially one of such a higher level like her. I had at this point only heard stories of ghosts such as she, who seemed almost completely conscious and aware even in death. You mentioned that you are often within the past. Maybe something could have occurred while you were in that, and did not witness the event of which we speak. She seemed indignant at this statement. I am always aware of what happens in my temple, Watchman. Her voice was sharp like a razor's edge. I know when a brick tumbles from the wall, or a crack appears in the window. I am familiar with how deep the dust buries the rotting pews of my abode, and I tell you that there is no human life in my church anymore. Perhaps he is confused. Patrick's eyes were dark with confusion and some rage. A sneer had appeared on his lips, and I gripped his shoulder in an effort to remind him to use restraint. So insulted was he that he had forgotten his initial terror and awe of this proud spectre. Even so, Patrick spoke through gritted teeth, may we still look about to make sure of my confusion? She hovered without response, and there was no sound other than the creaking of the warped ancient rafters. You should leave, Watchman. Her voice was low and threatening. Your presence here is an insult to me, offender, and the memory of this place. At one time, all were welcome within these walls, but those days have ended, Watchman. You are not welcome here. You who serve this city as you do have no honor. You who would slay the innocent and lost should you be ordered to by some prefect or politician. Patrick's voice broke with the injury inflicted by her words. They were protecting the other innocents of the city. There were thousands of children who would have died should the plague have left these neighborhoods. They begged the people not to approach the barrier. They shouted and fired shots in the air so that they would not come closer. But there were those who kept coming, those who had tried to sneak through the back alleys and sewers. They had to serve the greater good. The whole city would have died. They were not proud. They lived in shame and self-hatred all the rest of their years. Her very presence seemed to grow as her light filled even the dark shadows of the chamber. A wave of biting cold fell over us like a wind of the deepest freezing winter. She seemed closer now, and her words were spoken as if directly to our pounding hearts. Their shame and self-hatred will never measure enough, Watchmen. Cowards hiding behind a wall and firing shots at the dying while their own families are warm and safe at home. Killing one child to protect their own, slaying one woman so that their wives and sisters may live. What were they to do? He screamed with tears welling in his dark eyes. They should have died. Her voice was like a crack of thunder, and her ghostly hooded form now only inches from his. They should have helped, cared, nursed, and protected. They had no right to stand in judgment of life and death. Those people who were imprisoned here were the poor, Watchmen. This is the only reason the barrier was erected. The Watch was slaying the sick who were poor. This whole side of the city was a slum, and the rich paid their militia to let it rot. The rich who could afford medicines and healers and hospitals sent an army to slay those who had nothing, and that is your proud legacy. Leave. Leave my temple. Leave my sight, or I will visit a wrath on you like your fathers never could imagine. I had already begun stepping back towards the door, and had now grabbed Patrick by his arm and pulled him along as the apparition seethed with raw agony, her face seeming almost to twist and transform as her eyes glowed bright and star-like with anger. Patrick had still not realized the danger, so profound were the emotions she had awakened and stirred in his heart. This was the effect of such spirits in their interactions. They generated a massive karmic weight which would drag the living into its vortex with its energy. I now realized that it was we who were feeding the ghost with our shame and regret. It was our energy which had drawn her closer to our time and made her consciousness sharp and clear with our connections and guilt. I imagined that we had also made her very strong and anticipated that she could enact a great amount of damage on us physically as well as psychically. It was the only massive willpower of the woman's personality which had bound her from giving into fury yet. This was not a person who had been naturally destructive or violent, and her sense of honor had remained enough to hold her back to this point. We had now retreated to the street, and I turned to see the spectre standing furious at the door, fading as we fled into the darkness. "She was lying," Patrick stated, as he rolled the tobacco from the small pouch on his belt into a brown piece of smoking paper. "What?" I gasped, as I took my snuff box from my pocket and snorted a pinch. "Doesn't that strike you as somewhat absurd? We were nearing the barrier line, and I could see the high wooden fence lying distantly with lanterns along its top. And why, pray tell, is that? You don't think a ghost can lie? So you're suggesting that this revenant, which served the high spirit of honor and gave her life to protect and care for the poor, now stands before us and blatantly lies? And for what purpose? What reason has she to deceive us?" It would be a reason that would be worthy of such a person showing such a fracture in its dignity. It would be due to a concern which was as great, if not of more importance, than the strong character she had cultivated in life. Probably something linked to her reason for being in such a state, a reason that is probably well part of her anchor event. My guess is, based on what we have learned of her nature, she is protecting something. She would not lower herself to the dishonor of lying for herself. So my guess is, she protects another. That's very clever, Patty, but still makes no sense. She would have to know of the horror you described and actually defend it from scrutiny. Maybe that is why Athinda has not embraced her. Perhaps it all ties together. You're still not letting this go, are you? I am not. We are just now beginning to get somewhere at Tillinassus. We may well have to seek help from someone more experienced in paranormal matters, though. Oh, so now you plan to drag Ilden into this mess? I do, and I think he will greatly enjoy the challenge. Great high spirits. I think you have lost your last nut, Patty.